What is yagya in its essence? Yagya in its essence, in all forms, offering back to that what somehow undergone fragmentation, so as to bring back wholeness. This is in essence what encapsulates the very meaning of offering. Whether this was Mahatma Gandhi's exclaiming, without sacrifice there is no religion. Of course, he meant without sacrifice there is no Dharma. So whatever we do requires some sacrifice. And that understanding is what makes it truly a will. This is where the will of Nara reflects the will of Shiva at its opposite end.
Just wanted to understand the interplay between will and surrender. On the day one, when you said, what do you really, really, really want? And, you know, the will to power. And then at the same time, coming from India, like the way I understand Samavesha, there's like a very strong element of surrender involved in that. So for me, it just triggered this curiosity of how does that interplay work, but also how does will translate from Shiva to Nara? Is there any relation between the will of an individual and then the will of Shiva? And how does it sort of cascade? And the context is, personal context is that I find myself in these specific milestones in life where I need to take a decision. And over the last few years, it's been like a realization that I don't understand what's the cost of wanting something. And I started to feel that I actually don't want to ask for anything. Whatever comes is what I want to take, but I don't want to really ask. But then on day one, when you said that, you know, what do you really, really, really want? I was like, am I getting this wrong? Am I supposed to? Because since I let go, things have happened in my life in terms of, you know, just general career, relationships, everything. Things have happened which if I wanted, whatever I could have imagined, it's better than that. So I kind of started to feel that I'm happy this way, that I really don't feel like I want to ask something, and I don't know the costs of wanting something, especially in context of, in some of your videos you mentioned about, you know, some debts need to be settled. So a lot of times when I get this fork between will and surrender, it's always to do with that that settling of debts, where I feel like the surrender path feels like it's going to come with some cost. Mm-hmm. Maybe not the most ideal path that I feel at the moment that I should take, but then I kind of keep flipping that. But maybe that's the path that I'm supposed to take to, you know, settle some of the debts. But then I feel like, but I also should maybe have some choice in all of this as well. But I don't, but not at the cost of like postponing it to later, that, you know, it still has to come out in some way. So just wanted to understand that from a personal perspective also, but also very curious from a knowledge perspective on how that interplay happens. Because I understand that Ichha Shakti is also a Shakti, but that what's happening between Ananda and Ichha Shakti, does that have any connection? When we make the triangle, we always talk about this path, but then we always draw an arrow, both ways arrow between Shiva and Nara. So I'm just curious how will kind of flows through that.
Effort versus surrender or will, and how it all sits together. So that surrender here can be seen in a cultural sense, right? It can be seen as a leitmotif of a civilizational consensus. That surrender here could be seen and understood as part and parcel of some of the most highly cherished concept, which is exemplified in offering, yagya, the sacrificial offering here. So the spiritual practice is considered to be, from time immemorial, settling of the affairs, more than, oh, what I want or what I don't want. It's not so much about, oh, in the age of liberal democracy, when there are so many things that I can choose from, the variety of what is out there in the marketplace of whatever can be chosen, and then one of the products is enlightenment, or self-realization, or whatever it may be packaged like and called, and then it comes with Chinese flavor, with Japanese flavor, with Korean flavor. It's like this size noodles. It comes with, certainly comes with variety of, South Indian cuisine and North Indian, and there's no lack of that, right? This is dining in, take away, but ultimately it all boils down to that settling of the affairs. So I will suggest something here without necessarily insisting, just offering some kind of potential understanding. So you've asked, how does that will, let's say, when it is spoken of as that ikcha, right? That, awareness, bliss, right? Will or volition, cognition, action, because that's what it is, right? This volition, cognition, action. This cognition contains in itself the very meaning of the gnosis. So this will there is the will in its absolute sense, obviously. And in some expositions it is spoken as such, right? And it's spoken with this, that it is absolute will, absolute knowledge, right? Absolute action. How does that translate? Does Nara has the will of its own, or what degree and how? How do I know that the will, my will, is thy will, or is it subordinate? Is it? My suggestion here to look at it in this way. So if we understand that the will at its absolute level is for the sake of manifestation, then the will at the level of Nara must be for the sake of unification. So at one pole of its opposite, the will exemplifies the power to be many, the power to manifest. The true essence of the will at the level of Nara, which is awareness in its state of concealment, the measure of whether this is really will and not just wanting, not just mental impositions that play themselves out in the hall of mirrors, is that it has to contain in itself that evolutionary impulse, just as, let's say, if we speak about it in terms of verticality, at the highest level of its expression, this will is what gives rise to it all, what we then are here enjoying as a given. This is the whole world is the outcome of that will. Will to burst forth, will to expand and forgo the homogeneity, to forgo that what otherwise is indistinguishable. So in other words, without that will, right, Shiva remains in its own nature as Ananda, and nothing really taking place. So at the opposite end of that, if this is the test of the real will, if its impulse directed to that, what the original will here, speaking of the will to manifest, has to mirror that in terms of that act that we speak of as the culturally shared consensus from millennia to millennia in terms of settling the affairs, in terms of the consensus of the entire civilization. Brahman could be a summary of the entire purpose. India very often is seen, culturally speaking, as a repository in a particular geographical location of spiritual knowledge in case in some parts it will be lost. There are works like that. There are scholars who speak to that. There are propositions and even explaining how geographically and climatically it made it possible, protected by the Himalayas. Climate that allows that. It's not, it gets hot and humid. It has monsoon and what have you. But it doesn't have severe winters. It doesn't have something that you have to fight against the elements. So the continuation, let's say this continued investigation into consciousness is an uninterrupted affair made possible. And that cultural consensus here is that, exemplified by yagya. What is yagya in its essence? Yagya in its essence, in all forms, offering back to that what somehow undergone fragmentation, so as to bring back wholeness. This is in essence what encapsulates the very meaning of offering. Whether this was Mahatma Gandhi's exclaiming, without sacrifice there is no religion. Of course, he meant without sacrifice there is no Dharma. So whatever we do requires some sacrifice. And that understanding is what makes it truly a will. This is where the will of Nara reflects the will of Shiva at its opposite end. This is just, I'm suggesting something. I'm sharing with you some of my reflections on this. And because if we take the view that, well, from the point of view of non-duality, then if we do not disregard the existence of this experience of individual self, even if we speak about it in terms of apparently individual self, then anything that individual wills has to be the will of the creator. So in other words, here we're entering solipsism, the potential for falling prey to a tremendous inconsistency in a way. Inconsistency in the sense that every will and then every whim then would be considered a will. So I tend to not really take this as a point of reference because I don't see how helpful that is. So, in other words, there are not that many choices then left. It's either there is no individual will per se, which is kind of more or less agreed in a lot of, at least in the tradition of Neoplatonism and certainly in a lot of spiritual traditions in India, that there is no such thing as individual will. Individual simply lives within the given circumstances of the greater will, greater events and happening. So all it takes is to recognize that sooner or later and to no longer carry the burden of that heavy imposition that makes one feel as if one carrying something, right? Something heavy, something burdensome. And so that from that from there comes this acceptance, and then acceptance brings surrender. But at the same time, you're also asking, like, you're asking to clarify, is there any point in asking for anything? But well, this also, it's like in a prayer. When we speak of the prayer as communicating with, let's say, Godhead, whatever that is, universe, higher reality, Mother Nature, Father Spirit, and we delegate our burdens, problems, and we ask to interfere and to help, please. I need, I can't do it myself, right? I'm here, I'm fully. It's asking, isn't it? It's asking for something. Whereas the true meaning of the prayer is completely opposite. The true meaning of the prayer, even within the theological context of religious understanding, is asking that what is considered to be greater reality, simply to accept this erroneous understanding that might be plaguing my mind, that somehow something goes wrong, something goes astray, other than what you have planned, my dear, beloved God. So the prayer is not asking. Prayer is actually giving oneself in the moment of prayer. So the true origin of prayer is that. Prayer comes from praising. But then it kind of somehow turned into, almost at some point bargaining, like, dear God, if you don't do this, I no longer believe in you because I'm sorry, I had enough. Okay? Or like, where are you when I need you most? And all the rest of it. So, in this respect, you see, you come very close to answering this yourself. So, the surrender can be considered as a unwillingness to take charge of one's life, but that's not the true meaning of surrender. Surrender is not making appropriate steps when they need to be made. Surrender is not being in charge of one's life, responsibilities, situations. This is not surrender. Let's not confuse surrender with copping out. Surrender is a very, very it's a lofty, perhaps the greatest form of communion, where there is this understanding at the heart level that everything is already lit by the same light. And this surrender is simply a logical, in this sense, choiceless recognition and realization that things are as they are, not because it fits or not my understanding or my preferences. So when surrender becomes lived reality, it is indeed when prayers are answered without asking. Because things unfold anyway. Whatever has to be experienced will be experienced. We're entering now some other realms here of interconnectedness. So there is this graceful walk where we need to be very, very clear in our understanding so that we don't get swayed or dissuaded, seduced by the concepts of, like all this now very, very popular, of manifesting reality that one can live at one's will, just like, and it's a very, very profitable business. without understanding what actually it is comprised of, how much more in sync all this, what one has to go through in terms of the evolution of one's being here, in terms of that process of settling the affairs, in terms of what one's true purpose here is. And to me, it's exemplified. So when it is directed, the impulse towards that, then it's definitely activation of that will. The will which is directed at evolutionary, the impulse in evolutionary direction. And anything else, well, it's the way it is. It's like cause and effect. Every experience sows the seed for next experience, and there's no end to wanting, no end to needing. This also needs to be understood very clearly. It frees us from meanderings, and so life becomes simpler. And we still pursue our objectives. We're still free to set our intentions, because some also speak of that portion of free will which belongs to the, well, that kind of more of a concept which on par with New Age and spiced with quantum physics, right? This how there's always possibility living life this way or that way, this way or that way, this way or that way. We are constantly at the fork road. So myriad of choices we make takes and creates that trajectory. And the propensities, of course, is already there, set in motion. If you speak to a very experienced astrologer, they will tell you already all your predispositions at birth. So one already knows which predispositions are there. This is why we always recommend a good Jyotish reading, because it can be extremely helpful in understanding of one's strengths, limitations, understanding what to work with, rather than kind of stumbling constantly, second guessing. So,
two clarifications. One is yesterday when you were explaining the Samavesha process. So, in context of what you just shared in terms of the will of the individual, sort of mirroring back, wanting to go back to unity. In the second layer of Samavesha, the word is skipping my mind, Shakti Samavesha. So from the individual level to that level, there is a role of the individual's will to wanting to have the evolutionary growth. But then the way I understood what you explained yesterday is that beyond that, then it's then whose will is at play.
Mm-hmm. So yes, you're answering yourself. You see, so when we spoke about that triple penetration, the reason why the Anavo Samavesha, or individual penetration here on that level, is spoken of as entering, is because it's spoken from the point of view of an individual. So in other words, it will be inconsistent to speak about that in any other terms. So it is an individual, and it is supported by our experience, which I supplemented with the experience of, let's say, someone like, I illustrated it with my own example. When I would go into meditation, I will experience this expansiveness, this all-pervasiveness, touching this beyond space-time, coming back from these states of whatever level of absorption, recharged, renewed, but it's always with reference to the individual. Individual was intact. It would touch that level, it would be experienced there, but going back, it always remains at that level. That individuality is intact. Nothing happened to it. At the higher level of penetration, this is no longer the case. So this is why, in kind of a folk way of saying, that pedestrian saying, is that spiritual work itself comprises of do the best you can, the grace will complete the job. Like, meet it halfway through. This, to spill it in a kind of like really sort of every folk in a village will understand. Do the best you can, right? Do your job, do your part. And then when it comes to whether this is completed or not, this is no longer in your capacity. Why? Because that individual cannot survive that. There's a dissolution of that sense. So that is what the Samavesha here, and why it is spoken as Samavesha, because all this linked to that understanding. So this is very clear. You see that we will continue the topic of Samavesha tomorrow, which was just introduced in brief with regard to the from the point of view of possession or repossession. But it shares a lot with Samavesha spoken in terms of penetration here. So the goal here, if you will, from the point of view of how this is seen in the respective tradition, is a kind of conscious offering of one's sense of self, one's individuality, understanding clearly how things are, so that the essence of that individuality is being savored whilst in the body, and the body is then, with all its faculties, is taken over, repossessed by the power that in the first place is responsible for that extreme contraction within awareness, that forgoes its own omnipresence, omniscience, and so forth. So it's a lofty, of course, aspiration. It's a very powerful goal. But we will speak tomorrow more about what happens then to the individual. Does the individual go or stays? Well, if you reflect on it attentively enough, you will see that individual did not exist in the first place. So nothing really is being forgone here. It's a pure process. That's why today the distinction was made, Samavesha as a movement and a Samavesha as a state. Until Samavesha is a state, movement continues. Churning continues. It takes us back to the very beginning of the immersion. So the churning continues. We touch that bliss, and that bliss can become so overpowering we cannot withstand. We cannot withstand this. So we are given a relief. So we released from that, see? Because the body cannot take it. The physiology cannot take it. And then it leaves, of course, that resonance throughout all the cellular structure, that it wants to re-experience that again. So there would come a moment when the churning will continue. That in itself is in the nature of consciousness. In the nature of consciousness. So this is why in Tantra, the erotic and sexual analogies are very often given, because these are the closest analogies to the direct and visceral experience of Ananda. So really, one requires a certain degree of cultural freedom to understand the poignancy and the depth of this without trivializing it, or without being put off by it, or without being seduced in the wrong, for a wrong reason into it. Because that's what happened at some point. Tantric teaching was hijacked by all that. You know, it just took that aspect and made it into the main focal point of attention of retreats and programs. And so this analogy is like that, see? So that resonance after the most powerful experience of Ananda in a state of complete and utter union, where dissolution of the separate sense of self is viscerally experienced, cannot be a constant state, because it's impossible to function in that state. We cannot withstand that. Right? You cannot function in a state of orgasm. It's like that. And then we feel saturated, and like saturated, satisfied, but only for a little while. The desire comes back with a greater force, because the resonance is left here, right? The memory, cellular memory, see? So it goes back there again. So this analogy is given to the consciousness. That's how consciousness is experienced. This is why once touched that level, we will keep going back to that. Keep going back to that. So the Samavesha here would be a movement until something happens in the system when it's no longer a movement, but a state. So in other words, it's no longer subject to coming and going. It's simply a state. So this is what the Atma's goal in Trika Shaivism. So we will speak about it tomorrow more. This gives us like a little bit of entrance that perhaps we could argue that from the point of view of Kashmir Shaivism, they take the concept of self-realization, or even the concept of Jivan Mukta, further. So